What do these items have in common? A tub of butter, a DVD, a brassiere. Ladies and gentlemen, those are all items I have found in my oven. Putting everyday objects in unusual places is just one of a host of symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia. 4 years ago, we sat in a sterile hospital consulting room following 2 years of exhaustive tests on my wife's memory. The result? Mrs. McGinty, you have dementia. The diagnosis was delivered in a voice as cold as the steel on the blade of the knife that slipped into my heart. Bam! It was like a physical blow. My stomach turned over. Every muscle in my body tensed, and tears began to flood down my face. To my eternal shame, the first thought, what am I going to do now? My thoughts should have been with my wife Margaret, who was also in floods of tears. But that diagnosis felt so much like a death sentence that I was already into the first stages of selfish grief. And if I'm truly honest, that sort of behaviour wasn't unusual for me. I had always been self-interested, self-conscious, self-absorbed, often putting my needs before Margaret's. A typical Stone Age husband. But there's an upside to Alzheimer's. Margaret's forgotten all about that. And now, because her memory resets every few minutes, she thinks I'm Mr. Wonderful several times a day. But there were no good support networks near where we lived, and Alzheimer's hits hard. And Margaret's friends started to desert her. They weren't mean. They weren't nasty to her. They didn't do anything you could ever consider was wrong. They just started going to a different cafe for morning coffee. They started their afternoon walk at a different time in a different place. They basically just hid from her. They couldn't cope with the unusual behaviour. They couldn't cope with the memory lapses. And they couldn't cope with her asking the same question again and again and again and again and again and again. Eventually, she became totally isolated and slipped into depression. I didn't even notice any of this. I maintained a facade of normality. I went to work every day. I carried on with my hobbies. I met and socialised with my friends. While all the time, at the very core of my being, wondering why I had been dealt such a dreadful blow. That selfishness did not disappear easily. It took a while, but eventually I too got depressed. And as Margaret's depression deepened, like a dutiful husband, I spiralled right down into hell along with her. There were dark days and long, dark nights where we both just sat and brooded and moped and wondered why life had become so cruel. But then, one day, by post, came salvation. A simple diary of events from our local Alzheimer Society. The very next day, I stayed away from work and I took Margaret to one of these events, singing for the brain. And as we sat and we sang the old songs, Margaret's favourite, "Take me back to the Black Hills of Dakota." Yeah, to be fair, Margaret sings it much better. I watched as her spirits lifted and soared. And like that dutiful husband, I soared right along with her. I talked to other carers who told me how they had adjusted. They taught me that dementia doesn't strike two people the same way. They taught me strategies for coping. And they taught me that despite Margaret having a devastatingly serious illness, there were still good times to be had. Good times, like a couple of weeks later, we sat in a crowded cafe. When bam, a woman hit me with her bum on the way out, and Margaret began to huff and puff, and I signalled for her to stop. But it was too late. So another woman slid into the seat alongside. Well, she got in without hitting you, and her bum's much bigger than the other woman's. Sometimes with Alzheimer's, the social filters are the first thing to go. But as we drove back from singing for the brain, Margaret chatted in ways she hadn't in many months. And I responded in ways I hadn't since the day of the diagnosis. And even as we sat and sang songs from the session, "Take me," I won't put you through the singing again, don't worry. We laughed, we chatted, and I thought about the biggest lesson I had learned. Things had to change. And because Margaret's no longer capable of the sort of rationalisation needed for change, that change had to come from me. I had to turn into Mr. Wonderful. And the change was swift, and it was huge. I left my job, we sold our house, we moved back to Scotland so that we could be beside our family support network. I now work from home so that I can look after Margaret 24 hours a day. And when that's not possible, or it all becomes too much, I can turn to Margaret's family or my family, and they're all too happy to look after her for a few hours so that I can come to an event like this, or for a few days so that I can go away for a weekend and recharge my batteries and come back refreshed and ready to start caring again. I cashed in my pension early so that we could travel the world while we could both still appreciate it. We've been to almost every country in Europe. We've driven back and forth across America 4 times so that we could visit our son and daughter-in-law in California, so that they can spend some quality time together while that's still possible. We've cruised with them from Alaska to the Caribbean. And despite what people say about dementia, Margaret can still lay down new memories. We spend many an evening poring over a photo album, and nothing gives me more joy than to see Margaret look at a photograph and say, "I remember." Caring for someone with Alzheimer's isn't easy. Caring for anyone with dementia is tough. I've had to turn from being a husband, a lover, a companion, a best friend, into a carer, and more like the parent of a small child. But it's not like being the parent of a small child. It's not like taking a baby that can do nothing for themselves and watching them turn into a child, an adolescent, and a responsible adult. It's taking someone who is a responsible adult and watching them turn into a stroppy adolescent, a small child, and a baby that can do nothing for themselves. And there is no good outcome. But Margaret's not at that stage yet. She still hangs on to a bit of her wit and humour. A few weeks ago, we had a visit to the doctor. Do you have any allergies? Penicillin, says I. I think she can answer for herself. No, I can't. I've got Alzheimer's and I don't remember. It's moments like that that make me realise that the person I love is still inside there somewhere. Every day I face new challenges, and every day I grow as a result of rising to those challenges. Margaret's condition and her undying love for me through all those years I was such a selfish idiot have made me more loving, more caring, more mindful. So when strange things happen around our house, I don't get upset. When I can't find the frying pan, I don't get frustrated remembering it'll turn up in the broom cupboard or in a drawer in the freezer, but it will turn up. When Margaret pours coffee into the milk jug or the sugar bowl for the 5th time in the same morning, I don't get angry. No matter how often we go out for a meal and Margaret can't remember what food she likes and what food she doesn't. No matter how many hours I spend looking for her spectacles that are in the pocket I've asked her to check 6 times. No matter where Margaret's brassiere turns up, I just smile and reflect gratefully on the growth that adversity has brought to me. Because in the end, there would be no Mr. Wonderful if it wasn't for Mrs. Wonderful.